I'm super excited about this talk today as we are diving into what is on top of mind of the CIOs who are running large SAP system landscapes. So let's get started. Eric, you talk to CIOs every day. What is the real sentiment that you are hearing from them right now about SAP's push towards Cloud ERP and the subscription model?
That's a good question. I'd say the common terms that would best describe what most CIOs are feeling as it relates to a potential move to S/4HANA is trepidation and uncertainty. Mm-hmm. There's uncertainty in the roadmap for when ECC is going to really be discontinued, what's going to happen to our customizations that we created, how long will this really take, how much will it really cost. So that's the uncertainty that many CIOs face. The other thing is trepidation. And the reason I say trepidation is because a lot of CIOs are perfectly happy with their ECC environment. It's working well. It's not creating any real problems. It's been stable for a certain amount of time. They've created their own intellectual property and customization in the software. And so they're really just trying to figure out, why do we need to make the move, or do we need to make the move to S/4HANA? Do we need to do it now?
Is that about the same that you see, Luiz?
Yeah, definitely. I think the point of the pressure for putting dates on the system is a big issue because, like you said, so clients still realize what they're going to do, right? And maybe they needed to do a business case, more detailed understand about the priorities. And then SAP say, no, you need to do that. But what's interesting, they had changed the date already, right? A couple of times, right? So I think it's a real proof that the clients are not really seeing the business case. And on top of that, about the uncertainty, so SAP introduced this Cloud Rise contract back 5 years ago, and that creates much more uncertainty. It's not only the upgrade itself, but the entire model.
What's the moment when the CIOs are rethinking their SAP strategy? What's the moment that triggers potentially a pivot from what they have been pushed towards?
I think the big thing that CIOs see that causes them to pivot is the recognition and realization that they don't fully understand necessarily what the time implementation is going to be, how much it's going to cost, what the time to value is going to be, and what they're going to do with all this customization and all these capabilities they've built in their legacy SAP environment. So usually that's the pivot point or the turning point where CIOs say, hold on a minute, do I have other options? Do I need to follow SAP's roadmap, or should I maybe stop and think about what do I really need? What does our business need? And what's the best risk-adjusted approach that we can take?
Exactly. Those business needs, they come in the front of it. What about you?
No, what I think is interesting because SAP, with the SAP ecosystem, they want to make the client believe there is no other option, right? So say, hey, you had to go. This is the path that we are taking. So you need to connect with us. Otherwise, you'll be left behind on innovation, for example, right? On support, for example. I think this is something that the client need to think, right? What are other paths, other alternatives?
And in the absence of having understanding of what those alternatives are and what the real options are, there's a lot of analysis paralysis. So in the meantime, a lot of CIOs just get stuck in fear because they don't know what those options are. They hear from SAP that they have to move to S/4HANA and they have to do it quickly, but it doesn't feel right to them. So a lot of times they feel stuck and they feel like they don't have options. But the good news is they do have options. Yeah.
Thanks for confirming that. They definitely have options. Let's move a little bit into a slightly different area and talk about the push into cloud itself. And so most of these clients today, they are running hybrid environments and not in cloud only. How does that shape your guidance to the CIOs around their decisions around ERP, cloud or not?
Well, I think you alluded to my answer to this in that it's not an all or nothing proposition. Most organizations we work with cannot realistically move their entire operations to the cloud. Not because they don't want to, not because they don't want to modernize their systems, not because they're resistant to change, but because cloud systems by definition and by design are less flexible than what a lot of CIOs and businesses are used to with their on-premise environments. we as an industry in the SAP ecosystem tend to label that as change resistance or not future-proofing your operations or living with technical debt. Those are all terms meant to make you scared and make you feel like you have no choice, and it's meant to influence your decision. But CIOs need to think a lot more logically about what they're doing. Just because a vendor wants you to modernize or wants you to be on the bleeding edge of technology doesn't mean you should be. And by the way, if you're a manufacturer or any other sort of business, you might find that there's a better way to spend your capital. You might find that there's a better ROI if I go build a new factory or I go acquire another company, because quite frankly, a lot of these big S/4HANA implementations are going to cost you as much as an acquisition or opening a new factory. So that's the decision that leaders are faced with, is which option is best? Do I really have to move from S/4HANA, or can I decide where I want to deploy my capital and then figure out how to manage the risk over here if I do stay partially on-prem or maybe even fully on-prem with ECC or even S/4HANA?
Luiz, what about the option of keeping your perpetual license actually and moving into cloud, but on your own terms?
Well, that's a very good point, because there is a lot of nuances when you say, hey, I want to move to cloud. What does it really mean, right? So recent surveys from the SAP user group say the majority of the clients, a big portion of them, are already deployed their SAP on cloud, but not necessarily moving to cloud means they needed to change all the contract, the licensing, everything. So you can run your workloads, SAP workloads, in any hyperscale, and you keep the relationship directly to the hyperscale. You keep your costs under control. I think one of the big challenges from SAP is because they have this private cloud option, right? And they have the public cloud option. There's two products. In the reality, most of the clients, they cannot replace what they have today using the public cloud version. So, and that's why SAP is forced to offer them this private cloud version, right? So, but I think that's caused some confusion in the client. Oh, I need to go to SAP ERP cloud. Okay, but what you're talking about? You're talking about the private cloud? Yeah, I'm already doing that, right? So I already have my SAP running on any of the hyperscales, right?
Great insights, Luiz. And that actually brings me to the next question. Let's talk a little bit about vendor lock-in.
Sure. So just for those that don't know, vendor lock-in is when a customer finds itself in a situation where it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to move away from that vendor. And for software vendors themselves, like SAP, that's their dream, is if they could get you locked in and committed for decades in the future, they have that predictable revenue, and they have those recurring revenue streams that will serve them very well. Their investors will drive up the stock price. The executives will get compensated very heavily. And so they all want you to get locked in. But what that does for customers is it limits your optionality. So in the future, as your business changes, it is going to change. You're going to find yourself in situations where you enter new markets, you buy new companies, you open new businesses, and SAP itself is going to change as well. It's going to evolve and change, and it's not going to change in parallel with what you need. And so you want to know that in the future, you've got flexibility. And I think that's the big hidden cost that a lot of organizations aren't factoring into their business cases or into their roadmaps when they commit to S/4HANA. Because the minute you go to S/4HANA, especially S/4HANA public cloud, it becomes extremely difficult to get that data out, to get the applications out, to get the workflows back into your control. And right now, it may not seem like a big deal, but in the future, when it comes time to replace or upgrade S/4HANA public cloud, that's where you're going to start to see a lot of problems with that vendor lock-in concept.
Luiz.
Yeah, in specific in the case of this RISE model, right? So I guess one of the issues is the lock-in with the bundling, right? Because it's not only lock-in in the license software, right? Because you are terminating your perpetual license, but also SAP is putting together the hardware, the infrastructure. So you are buying hyperscale workloads, but not from them. You're buying from SAP, and it's linked with the software license. And some other services and the platforms is all there, right? So in the flexibility, right? So in the future, we'll be very limited, right? Once you start doing when all these parts of the stack in the same vendor with a single contract. I think this is a very important aspect for the decision.
Especially when you think about the rising costs of any cloud solution in the future. SAP will have the right to increase your subscription costs as time goes on. And in some ways, it may feel to some customers as though they're handcuffed, they're constrained because they can't control now. Not only can they not control their data, their applications the way they may want to, but now they can't even control the cost because SAP can unilaterally decide what they're going to charge for their software going forward. And I think that's the real pressure point that is going to be tested in years to come.
Yeah, the reality, Eric, is that when you sign this bundling contract with SAP, like the RISE model, right? So you are technically shifting the TCO control to SAP. Because think about that. If you run your SAP, let's say, hosted in the Azure, right? In 3 years from now, you want to renew because the cost is too high. You can move to other vendor, right? When you are on this RISE model, no, because you don't have the infrastructure contracted directly from hyperscale. So it's all in the RISE contract. So you're not free to select another vendor for parts of the stack. I think this is really tricky, right? And some clients, they don't realize that.
This is a really good conversation we are having. And with that in mind, Eric, if a CIO asked you today, can I really run ECC and on-prem S/4HANA confidently into the 2040s? What would you say?
I would say with a resounding yes, you can. And despite what SAP and the SAP ecosystem may tell you that you can't reliably run ECC into the 2040s, you can. There is a point in history, if you go back and look at mainframe applications, we still have some clients that are still using unsupported mainframe applications that they have to support themselves. Is that ideal? No, it's not. I would not recommend that to people, but I'm giving you an extreme example of how companies are still using unsupported systems that have been around for 50 and 60 years. And guess what? Those companies are doing just fine. Yes, it's a risk. Yes, it's a pain. Yes, it can get expensive at times over time, but they're still running the business. The sky has not fallen and the world has not ended. What I would say is even though SAP wants you to move by 2030 to S/4HANA, you have other options. You have other ways that you can navigate that. You can buy yourself some runway. It doesn't necessarily need to be wait 50 years. I would not suggest that, but we can look at ways that we can extend that lifeline beyond what SAP is willing to provide.
Yes, and we need to remind this ECC platform and later the S/4HANA platform has been highly adopted by thousands of companies worldwide, right? And they are running their system. So the system itself is already proven and it works, right? So for many of these clients, the only reason they are coming to discuss an upgrade is because of the end of support. So we like to say we solved that problem, right? So don't worry about that. So we can support your system for more 15 years if you want, because the system works, right? And then the next question will be, okay, but if I don't do the upgrades, I don't have access to the new features, the new functionalities, the innovation. So, but with the composable, right, model, the innovation not necessarily needs to come in the core anymore. So you can do innovation on top of these stable and highly deployed systems.
Thank you, Luiz. And that brings me into the next topic, actually, and that is innovation. And SAP frames clean core as essential for innovation. And what's the reality that you see when you talk to organizations who are trying to rebuild this environment of clean core?
Well, from a pure technology perspective, I'll give you two perspectives.
Yeah.
From a pure technology perspective, it sounds great. That sounds like a good idea. Let's simplify the technology. Let's get rid of this customization. Let's get rid of the technical debt. Let's clean things up. That's great. In theory, I don't have a problem with that. In reality, the second answer is what does that do to the business? And that's where the problems lie. Because most of that customization that we see with SAP customers was not built because they just had nothing better to do or that they didn't trust that SAP could operate the way it was meant to. It was because they have some unique part of their operating model that needed to be addressed outside the system or outside the core software. So while technologists would say, yes, move to simplify to a clean core so that upgrades and innovation continue to happen in that core, that's great. But if your business can't run using that clean core, what good does that do you? And so what leaders have to do, this is really a leadership executive decision and issue that needs to be decided, is which risk and which cost is more acceptable to us. Your IT staff may not like that you might have a more complex technical environment, but your business may be very happy with that. It may actually make you much more profitable and much more scalable. So that's the way you have to look at it, is it is a trade-off. There's no perfect answer here. But the problem is many leaders and executives, and especially IT leaders, don't think about the business impact and then potential negative implications that go with that.
Mm-hmm. And we here at Rimini Street, we tend to think that we agree with the SAP on architecture, but we don't think that we need to build a clean core to innovate. Do you want to develop on that a bit, Luiz?
Yeah, I think the idea of a clean core for me is very clear. So SAP wants to have all clients running the core, right, as standard as possible, because if the clients go in this direction, in the future they can move it to the Cloud Public Edition, which is the real SaaS, which, by the way, is the border, right? SaaS software are clean core by design, right? But the reality from the most of SAP clients, so they have invested heavily in the past decade, customizing, adapting the systems to their specific business. That means they needed the customizations, right? So probably they cannot run the business if they go to a vanilla software. And then SAP say, okay, you remove the customizations from the core with this clean core approach, and you redevelop what you need in the platform on top of the core, right? But when we ask clients that are moving to S/4HANA clouds in the past few years, so most of them are still thinking about doing brownfield approach, which means a technical migration, because they cannot remove the core. So they say, okay, I will do these technical migrations, keeping my customizations, but they will realize they cannot benefit from the innovation. So that will be only the first step. So they will be forced in a certain point in the future to remove the customizations from the core. Otherwise, SAP cannot support or continue delivering new innovations in that. I think this is a big topic. So a lot of clients still realize what they're going to do to have a highly customized system in the clean core.
So, Eric, you have been vocal about composable architectures, and what makes that approach work so well in the SAP environments, in your point of view?
Well, composable approaches do a number of different things. First of all, it lessens the dependency on SAP or any one vendor. Mm-hmm. Getting back to your question about vendor lock, it does reduce or mitigates against the potential for vendor lock. It also provides a certain amount of flexibility that you're just not going to get out of any single ERP system, not just SAP, but you pick any big ERP vendor. They simply can't be everything to everyone within your organization. So composable ERP is a way now to integrate multiple systems that can handle different needs and have different strengths. Now, some technologists, again, might say, well, that sounds messy. Now I've got to deal with integration and data issues and things like that. And that's a valid concern. But that concern and that risk in many cases is a lot less than the risk of not being able to run your operations the way you need to and not being able to differentiate yourself from your competitors the way you need to.
Right. Luiz?
Yeah, I think the composable ERP, the technology that make it possible has been evolved in the past few years, right? So, and now we can run, right, different niche, for example, best of breed applications for certain areas, adopting cloud applications. You don't need it necessarily to develop everything in the core anymore, right? And that you're going to free up the clients to decide what's the best application for that. And in all sits better when you don't need to have everything in a single vendor, right? So the composable, the beauty part of that is so the clients can build their ERP platform, select what's the best application for them, for their business, for their industries, not necessarily relying only on SAP, right, on that.
And I love that talk about technology enabling organizations being competitive in the market and making sure that they can stay competitive. And that leads me to the next question to you guys, which is around tech debt. And because SAP calls custom code actually tech debt, we think about it as business value. And so how should CIOs think about their customizations in 2026?
Well, first of all, I would back up a bit and say, let's forget and set aside the negative connotations that the industry has created about this term technical debt and customization in particular. The industry has done a very good job of manufacturing this fear that if you have customization, something is wrong with you. You are not future-proof. you have technical debt, and you're resistant to change. Because clearly we're the technologists, we've built technology, clearly we know better than you do how to run your business. And of course I'm being facetious when I say that. But I think the key thing here is to recognize that what you said, the business value of customization. Now, I will admit there are generally a combination of different types of customization we see in just about every client. Some customization, yes, it's very tedious. It doesn't need to be there. It is maybe a form of resistance, but most organizations also have But most organizations we work with also have a substantial amount of customization that's very valid and very justifiable. And not only that, but also something that drives business value. And I take it one step further than that and say it's actually intellectual property. So this is your IP, this is your competitive advantage. And to simply throw that out because SAP is telling you that that's technical debt and that is bad, that's borderline reckless. And so we as leaders have to recognize that we need to assess it more objectively and know that there's no one size fits all answer and there's no all or nothing type of proposition. Usually it's going to be a hybrid. You're going to maybe get rid of some of your customization, and it does make sense to validate. Let's validate and make sure we have the customization cleaned up that we can, but you're going to be left with some amount of customization that's going to be extremely painful and risky and costly to remove.
Yes, my point is that in most of the cases, the customizations make it harder for SAP because they cannot deliver, right, the next versions if the system is highly customized, right? So, and they cannot sell the new products if the system is highly customized. So SAP needs to find a solution for that. But it's, like you said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So probably for many clients, is a great thing to have their specific business needs on the customization. So the good news is, so companies like us, we take care about the customization. So for us, it's not a problem the client run their ERP with customizations, right? But that's a problem for SAP because they cannot support the customization. But we do. So we say, yes, you can, of course, cleaning up the house, removing the customizations that are not so necessary, but all the necessaries in strategic customization, keep them. And we're going to innovate on top of that, right? We're going to support all of that.
A good way to look at that is think about Coca-Cola. And I know that's not technology related, but Coca-Cola did not become Coca-Cola by tasting like every other soft drink out there. They became Coca-Cola because they have a very unique formula that no one fully understands except for Coca-Cola. And was a time and place where IT was viewed as a potential for becoming that secret formula. But now the way the industry is going is it's moving towards a more vanilla, one-size-fits-all answer to IT, where IT is becoming more of a commodity, in my opinion, rather than a source of competitive advantage. And I think that's what leaders need to think about as well.
Yeah, and that type of differentiator will never be reflected in a standard shot. Right?
Absolutely true.
So you need to create yourself.
What is the most important thing SAP CIOs need to understand about SAP's subscription strategy and pricing right now?
If I had to pick one thing that's the most important, it's that those subscription costs are going to increase at an unpredictable rate in the future. What you're paying right now or in year one of your SAP subscription is going to be the lowest it will likely be. There's only one way for it to go. It's to go up. And it's not even just if you increase scope by adding more modules or more subscriptions. I'm talking just to keep the basic scope in place. Those escalation clauses will kick in over time. They have a right to raise the annual subscription costs. And then you add on top of that the fact that a lot of the pricing is based on consumption, like agentic AI agents. That, for example, will further increase the cost. So that would be the one thing I'd warn you on is when you're creating the business case, you really need to look at and forecast not today's dollars, what you're spending, but what you are likely to spend longer term. In many ways, that's unpredictable, but you at least want to have some realistic assumptions of what that might look like long term.
Yeah, so on top of that, what we will add is some of these migrations will take time, or maybe 1 year, 2 years and more. So, and during that period, we still need to run the current system, right? So be sure you keep the perpetual license for the period where you are still implementing that. Because we have heard some stories of clients that they have or terminated or reduced the footprint of the on-prem software. So, and for any reason, they needed to postpone the project or hold the project. They don't own the license anymore for the current system. So keep the license, right, as part of the negotiation. Of course, price protection, right, on the software that you are buying is also a good thing.
Well, this has been a really insightful conversation. And to wrap it up, if a CIO asks you right now for the 3 most smartest moves that they could take in this quarter to regain control of the SAP roadmap, what would you tell them?
The first thing I would suggest is to relax and take a deep breath, because a lot of CIOs right now are feeling an immense amount of pressure from SAP to move and to move now, and in many cases to move prematurely. So I think it's okay to stop and think. This is your business, it's your organization, it's your priorities, it's your needs, it's your budget, it's your resources, and you're the one that's going to have to live with the long-term consequences, not SAP, not anyone else. So that's the first thing, is stop, think, relax. Second thing would be to fully consider all of your options. Make sure you understand what your options really are, and you've done a good job of asking us some questions about exploring what are those options, how realistic are they? And then the third thing I'd say is just be realistic that no matter what path you go down, you are going to face risks, and you inevitably have trade-offs you're going to have to make, and that's okay. But to think that just because one scenario has some risks and trade-offs, and therefore you should avoid that path, such as staying with ECC for beyond 2030, for example, yes, there's a risk there, but you also have to consider the other risks of if you do prematurely move to S/4HANA, as an example. So those are the 3 things I would say are most important.
Thank you, Eric. And Luiz?
I 100% agree with you, Eric. So don't rush just because the vendor is saying, I will not support your software anymore, right? So you have plenty of alternatives. So the vendor should not drive your agenda, right? So you should drive your business, right? Priorities. So don't get pressured. I think it's a great thing. The second thing is make the business case, right? So many clients, I ask, okay, why are you doing this now? Do you really need it? And a lot of them say, no, I'm just doing it because it is putting all this pressure, but my system is running well. I can see myself running my business in this system version for many years from now. Okay, so make your business case. You should do the move when you have, right, the right ROI, right? So I think this is very important. And of course, look into alternatives. We told you that before. So SAP and the ecosystem try to convince you there is no alternative, right? So a lot of clients, they go to the board, say, I need to do that, even though it's not priority, even though I don't have the budget, because I don't have an option. So this is the only option possible. No, well, there are. Rimini Street is a clear alternative, at least if you need to take a breath and get back to that in the future.
I'm confident that this talk today has raised a lot of questions with the audience, and I'm sure that all the 3 of us would love to continue the conversation with you. Be in contact with us. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Eric and Luiz.
Thank you.
Thank you.